Wow. Okay. So this is a deep one. This time you really sent us down a rabbit hole with this set of sources. This is JFK, right? I mean, we're talking like the heart of conspiracy theories here. And what's really fascinating is, like you've pulled together this stuff that connects Lee Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby, the CIA, organized crime. It's a lot to unpack.
It is, and what's particularly interesting is the amount of declassified information you've included. You've really dug deep, and these documents offer a glimpse, behind the curtain of the official narrative. It's a chance to explore those often overlooked connections and see where they lead.
Totally. Our mission today isn't necessarily to you know, solve the JFK assassination. That's probably not happening. But what we can do is use your sources, and we're talking book excerpts, articles, all kinds of stuff to trace those potential connections. Who knew who, what were they doing, were they really just lone wolves, that kind of thing.
Right. And we'll stick strictly to the information you've provided. No wild tangents, no going off the rails. Just a deep dive into your sources, looking for those, those aha moments where things click into place.
Love it. All right, so buckle up, everyone. Let's start with the patriarch of the family, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., the man who built the Kennedy fortune. And, the stories about how he made that money are pretty interesting, to say the least.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Your sources suggest that he was deeply involved in the stock market, like back in the Roaring '20s, and employed tactics like insider trading and stock pooling. Now, while those were technically legal at the time, ethically, well, let's just say there are some pretty serious questions about how he built that early fortune.
Right. And then, as Prohibition was winding down, he very strategically positioned himself to basically dominate the soon-to-be booming liquor market. Securing those exclusive import rights for big brands like Haig and Haig, DeWars. Gordon's a very shrewd businessman, for sure. But then there are these persistent allegations about his connections to organized crime, which adds a whole other layer to the story.
Yes, and your sources point to some, potentially significant relationships. There's the alleged partnership with Frank Costello. I mean, Costello himself reportedly claimed they were partners in the liquor business both before and after Prohibition. And Gore Vidal, who, as you know, had some insights from his own family, even wrote about regular dinner meetings between Kennedy and Costello at the Kennedy residence. And, to back that up, you've included Seymour Hersh's interviews with officials from that era who suggested Kennedy was deeply involved in bootlegging. And one source, Abraham Marovitz, even said something to the effect that Kennedy couldn't have operated on that scale without the approval of organized crime.
Wow. So, we're talking about the potential for some deep, deep connections to the mob, maybe even going back to Prohibition. And while the sources you've provided don't offer definitive proof, the fact that these allegations keep popping up is certainly, it makes you wonder about the truth. And then, to make things even more interesting, in 1934, FDR appoints Kennedy as the very first chairman of the SEC. Talk about a plot twist. Right. The man who allegedly made his fortune through some, shall we say, creative stock market tactics is now the guy in charge of regulating Wall Street. But what's undeniable is that once he was in that position, he actually did implement some pretty significant reforms, like curbing insider trading, putting in place disclosure requirements, things that really laid the groundwork for how we regulate the market today. It's a fascinating contradiction. Yeah. Someone who thrived in a less regulated environment, becoming the architect of those regulations. Okay, so then we have his time as the U.S. ambassador to the UK. And, well, let's just say it was a controversial period. His whole appeasement approach to Hitler, his apparent skepticism about democracy, even hints that he thought the U.S. might need to consider totalitarian methods. It all ultimately led to his resignation. So we're seeing a complex and at times a morally ambiguous figure, right? A man of immense wealth and power, potentially connected to some very powerful underworld figures. Now let's turn our attention to Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who would forever be linked to the Kennedy family tragedy.
Right, and the sources you've given us emphasize that Oswald was already on the radar of the FBI even before the assassination. They were monitoring his activities, particularly his visits to the Soviet and Cuban embassies in Mexico City. And, you've included J. Edgar Hoover's memo written just days after the assassination. It shows a clear concern with public perception, this real need to convince everyone that Oswald acted alone. And then you have a Justice Department memo from 1964 concluding there was no evidence Oswald was an FBI informant. It's all very, very layered.
Absolutely. His military service is also intriguing, specifically his time at Atsugi Naval Air Facility in Japan as a radar operator. What jumps out at you about Atsugi in this context?
Well, it's important to understand that Atsugi was a major CIA hub during the Cold War. It was a key site for launching those U-2 spy planes, the ones involved in those really sensitive reconnaissance missions. So Oswald, being stationed there as a radar operator, would have been in a position to, potentially monitor air traffic over the region, maybe even track those U-2 flights. It raises some interesting questions about, what he might have been exposed to during that time.
Right, exactly. Then we have his interest in the Russian language, his defection to the USSR in '59, his marriage to a Russian woman, and his eventual return to the US. The whole episode just, like, it's shrouded in mystery. And of course, there are those lingering questions about whether the government was involved or, at the very least, keeping a very close eye on him. And then there's his trip to Mexico City in late September 1963, those visits to the Cuban and Soviet embassies while trying to get visas. This seems to be a really crucial point in the story, and one where we see some significant inconsistencies.
It is. Despite the CIA's known surveillance of those embassies, both the Soviet and Cuban embassies, your sources highlight this really striking lack of any photographic evidence placing Oswald there. There's actually a declassified document that explicitly states that the CIA never obtained a photograph of him in Mexico City, and this is despite their Linevoy and Lionbrace operations, which, as you know, involved stationary cameras aimed at those very locations.
Okay, so no photos of Oswald, despite the CIA basically having cameras pointed right at the places he was supposed to be. That's a pretty big red flag, right? And then it gets weirder because the recorded phone conversations from the embassies have someone claiming to be Oswald, but they're speaking really bad Russian. Now, we know Oswald was fluent in Russian, so this is a huge discrepancy. And on top of that, you've got the testimony of the Cuban consul, Eusebio Asqui Lopez, who flat out said that the guy he met at the embassy didn't even look like Oswald. This all points towards the possibility that someone was impersonating Oswald, right? That someone was using his identity for some unknown purpose.
Absolutely. And the CIA's explanation that there was a surveillance malfunction precisely when Oswald was visiting those embassies, it's a bit too convenient, isn't it? It conveniently eliminates any hard evidence that could confirm or deny his presence.
Right. Totally convenient. Okay, let's bring another key player into the mix. David William Ferry, a pilot with documented connections to both Oswald and anti-Castro activities. What's the most intriguing part of Ferry's story to you?
Well, his involvement with the Civil Air Patrol in New Orleans is definitely important. You see, there's a photograph of him with Oswald at a 1955 CAP barbecue, and there are multiple eyewitness accounts placing them together. This directly contradicts Ferry's statements to investigators after the assassination, where he denied even knowing Oswald. I mean, his friend, Leighton Martins, he tried to downplay the photo, saying, oh, they just happened to be in the same picture, but come on.
Right, too much of a coincidence. Plus, we know that Ferry was a passionate anti-communist. Initially, he supported Castro, but then he became disillusioned with the regime. And your sources detail his involvement with the Cuban Revolutionary Front, which was a CIA-backed group, and their various activities, like the raid on the Huma ammunition depot. So we're seeing more and more connections to, covert operations and potential CIA involvement.
And then you have his close association with Guy Bannister, the former FBI agent, a real right-winger. Bannister's office at 544 Camp Street, it basically became a hub for anti-Castro groups, and there are multiple reports of both Ferry and Oswald being seen there. So it looks like we've got a whole network of interconnected individuals here.
And of course, we can't forget Ferry's death in February 1967, which happened just days after his name came up in Jim Garrison's investigation. The official cause was a cerebral hemorrhage, but, the timing of it just adds to the suspicion surrounding the whole case.
It really does. And speaking of suspicious connections, we need to talk about Clay Shaw, the prominent New Orleans businessman with those alleged and potentially very significant CIA ties through an organization called Permindex. If Permindex was a CIA front, it puts people like Clay Shaw right in the middle of this web of intelligence activity, doesn't it?
Exactly. Shaw was a decorated WWII vet, co-founder of the International Trade Mart. Outwardly, he was a respected member of the community. But then, Jim Garrison arrests him in 1967, accusing him of being part of the conspiracy to kill Kennedy. Shaw denied everything and was eventually acquitted. But that whole Permindex connection is still a fascinating part of this story.
Permindex. On the surface, it seemed like a normal trade organization based in Switzerland with shareholders from all over the world. Shaw was on the board representing the U.S. But then you have those bombshell allegations that were published in the Italian newspaper Pazzi Sera, claiming that Permindex and its subsidiary CMC were actually fronts for the CIA, engaged in espionage and even trying to, destabilize foreign governments. They even suggested a plot against de Gaulle. These claims were a big part of what fueled Garrison's investigation.
Right, and your sources highlight that there's a lot of debate about those claims. You have some people, like Max Holland, arguing that those Paziesera articles were part of a KGB disinformation campaign during the Cold War. Then you have others, like Joan Mellon, who strongly believe that the CIA links were real, citing interviews she did with the Paziesera editors. It's a real tangled web, and it shows just how complex the world of Cold War intelligence was.
Absolutely. And then you bring in Carlos Marcello, the head of the New Orleans Mafia. His deportation by Robert F. Kennedy in '61, officially because of some questions about his birthplace, though he managed to sneak back into the U.S. just a couple months later. That suggests he had some serious pull, right?
And that deportation definitely seems to have fueled a lot of resentment towards the Kennedys. There's that alleged threat from September 1962, where Marcello supposedly talked about cutting off the head of the dog. A lot of people interpreted that as a direct threat against President Kennedy.
Right. And then there are those later statements attributed to Marcello while he was in prison, where he allegedly said that he had the son of a bitch killed. Lamar Waldron's book cites what he claims are FBI records suggesting that Marcello confessed to orchestrating the assassination. These are still allegations, of course, but they add a whole other layer of intrigue to this story.
For sure. And then there are all these mysterious deaths, right? Like, just a crazy number of people connected to the assassination who died under, well, suspicious circumstances. You've got Thomas Henry Hank Killam, whose wife worked at Jack Ruby's club. He was apparently afraid for his life, even told his brother, "I'm a dead man." And then, boom, he's found dead in Pensacola with his throat slit. The official ruling was suicide, but I mean, come on.
Right. And then there's Dorothy Kilgallen, the famous journalist who was super critical of the Warren Commission. She was the only one who managed to get a private interview with Jack Ruby, and she even got an early copy of his testimony to the Warren Commission. She was supposedly about to, blow the whole case wide open, and then suddenly she's dead. Officially, it was alcohol and barbiturates, but her notes and research materials vanished, so, people have been speculating ever since.
Yeah, and then you've got Lee Bowers, who saw some unusual activity near the grassy knoll and died in a car crash. And Gary Underhill, the ex-CIA guy who claimed to know about a conspiracy and died from a gunshot wound, ruled as suicide. And William Sullivan, the high-ranking FBI official who was killed in a supposed hunting accident right before he was going to testify about the assassination. And of course, we can't forget about David Ferry and George de Mohrenschildt, both of whom died before they could potentially offer more testimony. I mean, it's a disturbing pattern, to say the least.
It really is. And the declassified CIA documents that you've included are super revealing, about how much the agency actually knew. The releases between 2017 and 2023 confirm that they were definitely keeping tabs on Oswald, including his trips to those embassies in Mexico City.
And de Mohrenschildt's connection to Oswald after he came back from the USSR is really interesting. De Mohrenschildt had these established contacts in the CIA, particularly J. Walton Moore. And there are records of multiple meetings between them. It definitely makes you wonder what the relationship was really all about and whether de Mohrenschildt was, wittingly or unwittingly involved in something much bigger. And then, of course, he committed suicide right before he was scheduled to testify to the House Select Committee on Assassinations after saying he was being persecuted.
It's all very unsettling. And when you look at the bigger picture, all the connections that your sources lay out, it's pretty startling. You've got Joseph P. Kennedy Sr.'s alleged mob ties, Oswald's time at a CIA-linked base and his defection, the links between Oswald's Dallas rooming house and people in Jack Ruby's circle, Ruby's own mob connections, and that weird pre-assassination dinner he had, the FBI and CIA tracking Oswald. But with all those failures and inconsistencies, de Mohrenschildt's CIA links and his death, Clay Shaw and the whole Permindex CIA allegations, Carlos Marcello's deportation and his alleged threats, and then, of course, all those mysterious deaths we talked about.
And it's important to remember, like your sources point out, this isn't just a bunch of random coincidences or crazy theories. These are documented facts, events, and connections that together form a pretty compelling pattern.
Okay, let's zero in on what went down with Oswald in Mexico City. So the official story is that Oswald was just there to get visas, right? But your sources point to so many inconsistencies that make you question that narrative. You have the photographic ghost, which is the total lack of any CIA photos of Oswald at those embassies, even though they were under surveillance. This is despite their L'Envoy and L'Embrace operations, which, as we said, use stationary cameras to monitor those locations.
And then the voices that don't match. We know Oswald was fluent in Russian, but the guy claiming to be him on those intercepted embassy phone calls spoke really bad Russian.
Yeah.
And to make things even more suspicious, the only recording where the person actually identifies themselves as Oswald is the one where the voice doesn't match.
Right. And you can't forget about the eyewitness accounts. We already mentioned the Cuban consul, Eusebio Askew Lopez, who said the guy he met at the embassy didn't look anything like Oswald. All of this really supports the idea that someone was pretending to be Oswald, maybe to frame him, or for some other reason we don't yet know.
And then, of course, the CIA's explanation: a surveillance malfunction at just the right time to erase any evidence of Oswald's presence. Way too convenient.
Right. And there's also this 1975 Senate memo, which is supposed to be fully declassified next year, that reveals that Mexican President Adolfo López Mateos was actually a longtime CIA asset. Apparently, he was helping them infiltrate the Cuban embassy in Mexico City. This suggests that there was a lot more going on in terms of intelligence activity than anyone knew at the time. And newly released documents apparently point to aggressive surveillance of those embassies and even claim that a guy identifying himself as Oswald was openly talking about killing Kennedy while he was in Mexico City. But the CIA seemingly didn't do anything about it, which is really strange.
Yeah, that's super strange. Okay, so we also need to discuss this huge revelation about the CIA reading Oswald's mail. It sounds like something straight out of a spy novel.
It is a pretty major revelation. The CIA was actively intercepting and reading Lee Harvey Oswald's mail, and they kept it secret for like 60 years. It's wild. And we now know the name of the CIA officer responsible, Reuben Efron. A 1962 memo clearly identifies him.
So here you have Oswald, a known defector, clearly someone who should be on their radar, and yet the CIA tells the Warren Commission they had no info on him. It's a blatant lie. And get this, Reuben Efron was present during Marina Oswald's testimony before the Warren Commission. It doesn't say what his official role was, which suggests he might have been there to, keep an eye on things, maybe even influence the investigation. And when you consider all the issues surrounding Oswald's time in Mexico City, it really makes you wonder if someone was setting him up or if the CIA was intentionally messing with the evidence.
It's certainly suspicious. And the fact that they hid this information for so long just raises even more questions.
Big time. Okay, so this leads to a huge question. What exactly did the CIA know about Oswald before the assassination, and when did they know it? It sounds like those documents that are supposed to be declassified in March 2025 are going to be really, really important.
Yeah, they could potentially change how we understand the whole situation. And, the fact that we now know Reuben Efron was monitoring Oswald's mail as early as 1962, that's huge. Remember, Oswald was a defector, so it's not surprising the CIA was keeping tabs on him. But for them to deny knowing anything about him, that's a deliberate cover-up, plain and simple.
Which leads to a chilling thought. Did they intercept the order for the rifle Oswald used to kill Kennedy? The timing lines up. Their HT lingual mail program was active by early 62, and Oswald ordered the rifle in March of 63. So was this a massive intelligence failure? A failure of communication within the agency? Or was it something even more disturbing, like a conscious decision not to intervene?
And this wasn't just a mail intercept issue. It's the whole pattern of failures surrounding Oswald. The Mexico City discrepancies, the Lemva Y problems, the secrecy around the CISIC file. As historian John Newman has pointed out, these all look like operational fingerprints, suggesting deliberate actions rather than just incompetence. And they all happened at critical moments leading up to the assassination. Plus, you have that memo from 1979 by Cleveland Cram, which talks about how information was super compartmentalized within the CIA. It's like maybe nobody in the agency had the full picture, and maybe that was intentional.
Right. And let's not forget about Reuben Efron's presence at Marina Oswald's testimony. Why was he there? Was he just an expert on Soviet intelligence? Or was he there to make sure she didn't say anything that would, reveal too much? And then, of course, there's the fact that so many documents are still redacted, even after all these years. They say it's for national security, but it makes you wonder what they're still hiding. Former CIA officer Samuel Halpern even said that they often bypass normal reporting channels for sensitive operations like, keeping tabs on someone like Oswald. It definitely feels like there's more to the story.
The bottom line is that U.S. intelligence, and especially the CIA, knew a lot more about Oswald than they let on. The mail intercept program proves that. He was under surveillance, and the big question is, why didn't they stop him? And why have they been covering up what they knew for so long?
Okay, let's talk about Jack Ruby now. He's usually portrayed as this, heartbroken patriot who just snapped and shot Oswald. But your sources suggest he might have been a lot more than that, maybe even a crucial link in the chain of events.
You know that quote from G. Robert Blakey? You kill the killer. That really gets at what Ruby might have been doing. And then you have Rose Cherami's warning just days before the assassination. On November 20th, 1963, she told someone that two gangsters working for Jack Ruby were going to Dallas to kill Kennedy. Nobody listened to her, and then, tragically, she died in a hit and run. It's almost like an omen, isn't it?
It really is. And Ruby's phone records from those weeks before the assassination are pretty damning. He was calling known mob figures Irwin Weiner, Nofio Pecora, Louis McWillie, Murray Dusty Miller. These weren't just friendly chats. It looks like he was coordinating something, sharing information, or at least making sure everyone was on the same page.
And when you look at the connections between Ruby and David Ferry, it's pretty striking. They both had ties to both Carlos Marcello and Lee Harvey Oswald. It's not just that they were both in Dallas, their lives were intertwined in ways that suggest a deeper level of connection. For example, Ruby worked for Marcello as an investigator, and Ferry was Oswald's former commander in the Civil Air Patrol.
Right. And then you have the FBI evidence that was suppressed, that interview with Louis Kutner that confirmed Ruby had deep ties to the Chicago mob. Apparently, some of his childhood friends became hitmen for this syndicate. So this wasn't just some nightclub owner who got caught up in something. He was connected.
Right. And his behavior after Oswald was arrested was bizarre, to say the least. He kept trying to get into the police lineup, he was lurking around the interrogation rooms, and somehow he had his gun on him when he shot Oswald. G. Robert Blakey actually concluded that it wasn't a crime of passion, it was a planned hit. And then you have Dorothy Kilgallen, who was the only journalist to interview Ruby alone. She said she was going to blow the case wide open, and then she died a few days later. Her close friend, Mrs. Earl T. Smith, also died soon after. It's possible they were both silenced to stop them from revealing what they knew.
And the timing of Ruby's cancer diagnosis is incredibly suspicious. His new trial was supposed to start on December 9th, 1966. The very next day, he's diagnosed with cancer, and he dies a few weeks later, on January 3rd, 1967. He never got to testify again. It's very similar to what happened with Ferry and de Mohrenschildt, both of whom died before they could say more.
It's a pattern that's hard to ignore.
Totally. So as we wrap up our deep dive into these sources, I think there are a few key takeaways that really stand out. The CIA hiding their mail surveillance of Oswald for all those years, the strange happenings and convenient malfunctions in Mexico City, and the strong evidence that Jack Ruby wasn't just some random guy who acted on impulse. All of this is why the material you shared is so fascinating and so important. It really makes you question the official story.
I agree. And for someone like you who likes to learn new things quickly but thoroughly, understanding these connections, even without having all the answers, can really deepen your understanding of this major historical event. It allows you to see the bigger picture without getting bogged down in all the details.
Absolutely. And it really shows how much we still don't know about what happened.
It really does. So, when you think about all these examples of hidden information, potential manipulation of evidence, and these convenient failures by the people who were supposed to be protecting the president, it makes you wonder, what does it say about the official version of history? What are we not being told? And what might we discover if we keep digging deeper? It's a question worth pondering.
It really is. So thanks for sharing these sources with us. And to everyone listening, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never be afraid to challenge the official narrative. There's always more to uncover.